Christmas Eve. Less than a week since James Mitchell, a single father, submitted his resignation. When the doorbell rang, the person standing outside his small apartment was not family or a colleague, but Alexandra Monroe, the CEO who had signed off on that letter. Under the cold rain, her voice trembled as she spoke. "I accepted you quitting, not losing you." James stood frozen. The woman who had always been ice-cold in boardrooms now stood here, afraid and hesitant. Why would a CEO come to a single dad's door on Christmas night? But to understand why Alexandra Monroe stood in the rain that night, the story had to rewind 6 weeks earlier to a Tuesday morning meeting that should have been ordinary. James Mitchell had worked at Apex Industries for 5 years. At 38, he was the kind of man who arrived early and left late, the kind who double-checked reports at midnight and answered emails during breakfast. Senior Operations Manager. The title sounded impressive, but the reality was less glamorous. Endless spreadsheets, constant firefighting, and a paycheck that barely covered rent in a decent school district. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with his 7-year-old daughter, a space small enough that he could hear her breathing through the thin walls at night. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, and his ex-wife had moved across the country for a fresh start. James got full custody by default, not by choice. He never complained about it. His daughter was the only thing that made sense in his life. Alexandra Monroe was a different story altogether. At 42, she had built Apex Industries from nothing, starting in a garage with a business plan and $20,000 borrowed from a credit union. The company now employed over 800 people and generated revenues in the hundreds of millions. She had been profiled in business magazines, invited to speak at conferences, and quietly feared by most of her employees. People called her the Iron Lady, though never to her face. She wore tailored suits in shades of grey and black, kept her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and had a reputation for making decisions in seconds that others would agonize over for weeks. The two of them had worked closely for years, but always within the boundaries of professionalism. James respected her. Alexandra relied on him. That was the extent of it, or so everyone assumed. The Tuesday meeting in question involved a logistics crisis. A shipment delay in the Midwest threatened to derail a product launch worth millions. The conference room was tense, voices overlapping as department heads argued over solutions. James was halfway through presenting a contingency plan when his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down and saw the school's number. His stomach dropped. He never got calls from the school unless something was wrong. He looked up at Alexandra, who sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. James cleared his throat and said he needed to step out. She nodded once, sharply, and he left the room with his phone pressed to his ear. His daughter had a fever, 102 degrees. The nurse said someone needed to pick her up immediately. James stood in the hallway, calculating. The meeting would run at least another hour. If he left now, the logistics plan would fall apart without him there to answer questions. But his daughter was 7 years old and sick and scared. There was no calculation to make, really. He went back into the conference room, apologized, and said he had to leave. A few people exchanged glances. Alexandra said nothing, just watched him gather his things and walk out. What James did not know was that 20 minutes after he left, Alexandra abruptly ended the meeting. She told everyone to reconvene the next day and dismissed them without explanation. Her assistant tried to remind her about a call scheduled with investors. Alexandra said to reschedule it. She spent the rest of the afternoon alone in her office, staring at reports she was not reading. Over the following weeks, small things began to shift. James noticed he was being assigned fewer late-night deadlines. Projects that would have required weekend work were suddenly extended by a few days. When he asked about it, his supervisor shrugged and said priorities had changed. James did not question it. He was grateful for the breathing room, even if he did not understand where it came from. What he also did not notice was that Alexandra had quietly reassigned some of his workload to herself. She reviewed vendor contracts late at night, tasks that should have been delegated to him. When her executive team asked why she was micromanaging operations, she told them she wanted to stay sharp on the details. No one dared to push further. Then came the late-night calls. The first one happened on a Thursday just before midnight. James was sitting on his couch, half asleep in front of a muted television, when his phone rang. He saw Alexandra's name on the screen and answered immediately, assuming there was an emergency. There was a technical issue with a supplier database, something that needed his input right away. They spent 20 minutes troubleshooting it together, her voice calm and methodical on the other end of the line. When the problem was solved, James expected her to hang up. She did not. Instead, Alexandra asked him a question that had nothing to do with work. She asked if he ever felt like he was living someone else's life. James did not know how to answer that. He said he was not sure what she meant. Alexandra was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Forget it. It was late," and she let him go. But the calls kept coming. Once or twice a week, always after his daughter had gone to bed, always starting with some work-related pretext that dissolved into something else. They talked about things people did not usually talk about with their bosses. Alexandra told him about growing up poor, about her mother working 3 jobs and still coming up short on rent. She talked about the years she spent clawing her way up, the people she had to outwork and outlast, and the quiet emptiness that followed every victory. She never said she was lonely, but James heard it in the spaces between her words. He shared things too. He told her about the guilt that followed him everywhere, the feeling that he was failing his daughter even when he was doing everything right. He described the way she looked at him sometimes, like she was waiting for him to disappear the way her mother had. He admitted that he did not know how to be enough for her, that he was tired all the time, that he sometimes sat in his car in the parking lot after work just to have 10 minutes where no one needed anything from him. The conversations felt dangerous in a way James could not name. They were crossing a line, though neither of them acknowledged it. By the time November arrived, the calls had become routine. James found himself looking forward to them, even as some part of him knew he should not. Then the merger talks began. Apex Industries was in negotiations with a Fortune 500 company, a deal that could triple the company's value overnight. It also meant an avalanche of work. 80-hour weeks became the norm. James started coming home after his daughter was asleep and leaving before she woke up. He missed her school play. He forgot to sign a permission slip for a field trip. One night, he got home just before midnight and found a drawing she had left on the kitchen table. It was a picture of their apartment with 2 stick figures inside. One was labeled me, the other was labeled Dad, but it was crossed out in red crayon. Underneath, in wobbly letters, she had written, "Dad is always gone." James sat down at the table and stared at that drawing for a long time. The next morning, he opened his laptop and typed out an email to Alexandra. It was 3 sentences long. He thanked her for the opportunity to work at Apex. He said he was resigning, effective in 2 weeks. He did not explain why. He sent it before he could change his mind. Then he closed the laptop and took his daughter to school, holding her hand a little tighter than usual. That evening, his phone did not ring. Alexandra did not call. For the first time in months, the silence felt heavier than any conversation. 2 days later, James received an email from Human Resources. His resignation had been accepted. Alexandra had signed off on it personally. There was no request to reconsider, no counteroffer, no mention of an exit interview, just a standard form letter thanking him for his service. James read it twice, searching for something that was not there, then deleted it and tried to convince himself this was what he wanted. The next day, Alexandra called him into her office. It was a Wednesday afternoon, grey and cold outside. When he walked in, she was standing by the window with her back to him, looking out at the city below. She did not turn around right away. When she finally did, her expression was the same one she wore in board meetings, controlled, unreadable, professional. She asked him to sit. He did. She stayed standing. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. She thanked him for his contributions. She wished him well in his next chapter. She asked if there was anything the company could do to make his transition easier. James said no, everything was fine. Alexandra nodded. She walked him through the final paperwork, her tone clipped and efficient. At no point did she ask why he was leaving. At no point did he offer an explanation. When it was over, James stood to leave. He looked at her one last time, hoping for something, some flicker of the person he had talked to on all those late nights. But Alexandra had already turned back to the window. He walked out of her office, rode the elevator down to the lobby, and stepped out into the December rain. He had worked at Apex Industries for 5 years. Now it was over. He told himself it was the right decision. He almost believed it. The first week after leaving Apex Industries felt like learning to breathe in a different atmosphere. James woke up without an alarm for the first time in years. He made pancakes for breakfast, walked his daughter to school instead of rushing her into the car, and spent the afternoon organizing closets that had been neglected for months. It felt strange and good and slightly wrong, like wearing someone else's clothes. He told himself this was what he had wanted. This is why he had quit. But when his daughter went to bed each night, the apartment became too quiet. James sat on the couch with his phone in his hand, scrolling through news he did not care about, waiting for something that never came. No late-night calls, no messages asking for his opinion on a logistics problem. Alexandra's name did not appear on his screen. He had not expected it to, but some part of him had hoped anyway. By the end of the first week, he realized he was not just missing the work. He was missing her. At Apex Industries, Alexandra was discovering the same hollow truth from the opposite side. The merger negotiations were moving forward smoothly. Her executive team handled problems with competence and efficiency. Department heads submitted reports on time. The company ran like a well-oiled machine, which should have been satisfying. Instead, it felt sterile. Meetings that used to spark with debate now ended in polite agreement. No one challenged her decisions. No one asked the hard questions James used to ask, the ones that forced her to think past the obvious answers. She worked later than ever, staying in her office until the cleaning crew arrived, and sometimes beyond that. Her assistant started leaving dinner on her desk because Alexandra kept forgetting to eat. The merger was the biggest deal of her career, the kind of achievement that should have felt triumphant. But every time she reviewed the contract terms alone, every time she made a decision without bouncing it off someone first, the victory felt increasingly meaningless. The worst part was the nights. Alexandra lived in a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a space designed to impress clients and reflect success. The silence there made her aware of how alone she was, how all the achievements and accolades had not actually filled anything. She found herself standing by those windows at 2 a.m, looking at her phone, scrolling to James's name in her contacts, and then putting the phone down without calling. What would she even say? That she missed their conversations? That she had made a mistake letting him go? The gap between them widened through sheer inertia. James convinced himself that Alexandra had moved on, that those late-night calls had never meant as much to her as they had to him. Alexandra convinced herself that James was better off, that he had made the right choice for his daughter and did not need her complicating his life. Both of them were lying to themselves, but neither knew the other was doing the same. Then the article appeared. It was published on an industry news website on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after James had left. The headline read, "Key Executive Departs Apex Industries Amid Critical Merger Talks." The article was short but pointed. It noted that James Mitchell, described as a trusted lieutenant to CEO Alexandra Monroe, had resigned without explanation during the most important negotiation in the company's history. It speculated about internal conflicts and raised questions about leadership stability. By noon, the article had been shared across social media. By evening, Alexandra's phone was ringing with calls from concerned board members. The rumors started spreading faster than Alexandra could contain them. People whispered that there had been a falling out between her and James, that he had been forced out, that the merger was in trouble. Some of the gossip was worse. A few people suggested there had been an inappropriate relationship, that James had left to avoid a scandal, that Alexandra's judgment had been compromised. None of it was true, but truth did not matter once a story started circulating. What mattered was perception, and the perception was damaging. Alexandra scheduled an emergency board meeting. She walked into that conference room wearing her coldest expression, the one that made people afraid to breathe too loudly. She addressed the rumors directly, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She said James Mitchell had resigned for personal reasons. She said his departure had been handled professionally and had no impact on company operations. She said anyone spreading unfounded speculation would be held accountable. The board members nodded and agreed and promised to help manage the narrative. But Alexandra saw the doubt in their eyes. They believed her, mostly, but they also wondered. That night, she sat alone and did something she almost never did. She cried. Not the delicate tears of someone sad about a setback, but the kind of crying that came from a place she usually kept locked away. She cried because the lies people were telling were not entirely lies. There had been something between her and James, something she had never admitted even to herself. And now that something was gone, destroyed by her own fear and pride and inability to be vulnerable. She had spent her entire life building walls to protect herself, and now those walls were the only thing she had left. The situation got worse before it got better. A few days after the article, Marcus Reed called. He was the CEO of one of Apex's longest-standing partner companies, someone Alexandra had worked with for years. They had always maintained a cordial but distant professional relationship. Marcus was successful, well-connected, and had a reputation for being charming in a way that felt practiced. He asked Alexandra to lunch to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. She accepted because refusing would have looked strange. The lunch was fine. Marcus was polite and engaging. He asked thoughtful questions about the merger and offered insights about navigating board politics. But somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, Alexandra realized this was not just a business lunch. Marcus was interested in her, not as a CEO, but as a woman. He was careful about it, never crossing a line, but the subtext was clear. When the check came, he suggested they'd do this again sometime. Alexandra said she would check her schedule, which was a polite way of saying maybe. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus kept appearing. He attended industry events he normally skipped. He found reasons to visit Apex's offices. He sent thoughtful emails that had nothing to do with business. Alexandra's executive team noticed. A few of them made approving comments about what a good match he would be. Even some board members seemed pleased, as if Alexandra dating someone appropriate would somehow stabilize her image and quiet the rumors. The pressure was subtle, but constant. So when Marcus invited her to a Christmas party hosted by a mutual business contact, Alexandra said yes. She told herself it was strategic, a way to show that she was unaffected by gossip and scandal. She told herself it was good for the company's image. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that she was exhausted from being alone, and part of her wanted to believe that someone like Marcus could be enough. The party was exactly what she expected. It was held in a historic mansion decorated with tasteful white lights and evergreen garlands. Everyone wore expensive clothes and drank expensive wine, and talked about mergers and markets and vacation homes. Marcus stayed close to her all evening, introducing her to people, refilling her glass, playing the role of attentive companion. At one point, he gave her a gift, a leather portfolio embossed with her initials. It was elegant and thoughtful, and probably cost more than most people spent on Christmas entirely. Alexandra thanked him and felt absolutely nothing. She left the party early, claiming a headache. Marcus offered to drive her home. She declined and called her own car. On the drive back, she stared out to the window at the city lights and thought about James. She wondered what he was doing right then. Probably reading his daughter a bedtime story in that modest apartment. Probably content in a way Alexandra had never learned to be. The thought made her chest ache. She arrived home just before midnight. The penthouse was dark and cold despite the heating system. Alexandra stood in the entryway for a long moment, still wearing her coat, holding the leather portfolio Marcus had given her. Then she walked over to the trash can and dropped it in. She did not want thoughtful gifts from appropriate men. She did not want strategic relationships that looked good on paper. She wanted something real, and she had let it slip away because she had been too afraid to reach for it. Meanwhile, James was experiencing his own form of isolation. The first few weeks of unemployment had been a relief, but as December wore on, reality started pressing in. His savings were disappearing faster than he had calculated. He applied for jobs, but nothing materialized quickly. He tried to stay positive around his daughter, but kids had a way of sensing when something was wrong. She started asking if they were going to be okay. James told her yes, of course, everything was fine. He was not sure she believed him. What surprised him was how much he missed Alexandra. Not just the job or the income, but her specifically. He missed the sound of her voice on those late-night calls. He missed the way she listened when he talked, really listened, like his words mattered. He missed the person she became when no one else was watching, the one who was uncertain and searching and human. James had convinced himself that leaving Apex was necessary to be a better father, and it was. But he had not anticipated the cost of losing her in the process. He thought about calling her 100 times. He would pick up his phone, pull up her number, and then put it down again. What would he say? That he made a mistake? That he wanted back in? Not to the job, but to whatever they had started building in those conversations. It felt impossible. She was a CEO dealing with a major merger. He was an unemployed single dad living in a rental apartment. The gap between them was too wide to cross with a phone call. On the afternoon of December 23rd, James took his daughter to the park. It was cold enough that they had the place mostly to themselves. She played on the swings while he sat on a bench, watching her and trying not to think about how he was going to pay January's rent. His phone buzzed with a text from a former colleague, someone still at Apex. The message was brief. It said people were talking about him and Alexandra. It said the rumors were ugly and probably not true, but James should know they were out there. He read the message 3 times and felt something twist in his chest. He hated that people were reducing what they had shared to gossip and speculation. He hated that Alexandra was dealing with it alone. Most of all, he hated that he had walked away without ever telling her what those conversations had meant to him, how she had made him feel less alone in a way nothing else did. He had left to protect his daughter, which was the right choice. But he had also left because he was afraid. Afraid of wanting something he did not think he deserved. Afraid of believing that someone like Alexandra could see value in someone like him. That evening, after his daughter went to bed, James sat in the dark living room and let himself admit the truth. He missed her. Not the CEO, not the boss, but the woman who called him at midnight and asked if he ever felt like he was living someone else's life. He missed her, and he had no idea what to do about it. Across the city, Alexandra was sitting in her penthouse, staring at her phone. She had opened her contacts to James's name and stopped there. Her finger hovered over the call button. It would be so easy. One tap and she could hear his voice again. But what came after that? What did she even want? She was not sure anymore. All she knew was that success felt empty, that her life felt like a beautifully decorated shell with nothing inside, and that the only time she had felt genuinely alive in years was during those late-night conversations with a man she had let walk away. She put the phone down without calling. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. She had no plans except work. That was fine. That was normal. She had spent plenty of holidays alone. But this year felt different. This year, the silence felt unbearable. Alexandra stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, James was probably putting his daughter to bed, living the life he had chosen. She told herself to let him go. She told herself she had no right to disrupt that. But as the hours ticked toward midnight, a different thought started forming. It was reckless and terrifying and completely unlike her. But once it took hold, she could not shake it. She could keep lying to herself, keep pretending she was fine, keep building a life that looked perfect from the outside. Or she could do something real for once. She could take a risk. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, Alexandra had made her decision. It was probably a mistake. It would definitely be uncomfortable. But she was done living a life that felt like a performance. If she was going to regret something, she would rather regret trying than regret staying silent. Alexandra sat in her car outside James's apartment building for over an hour, engine running, heat blasting, watching rain streak down the windshield. It was just past 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve. Most of the windows in the building glowed with warm light. Families were inside, probably wrapping last-minute gifts or watching holiday movies. Normal people doing normal things. She did not belong here. She had driven past the building twice already, circling the block like someone casing a robbery. Each time she told herself to go home. Each time, she made another loop. This was insane. She was a CEO about to close a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and she was sitting in a car in the rain, terrified of knocking on a door. But she had spent 3 weeks living in the gap James had left behind, and the silence had become unbearable. If she drove away now, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had been brave enough to try. Alexandra turned off the engine. The sudden quiet made her breath sound too loud. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Her makeup was still perfect from the Christmas party she had left 2 hours ago. She was wearing a black dress that cost more than some people's monthly rent and heels that were completely impractical for walking in the rain. She looked like exactly what she was. Someone from a different world, about to make a fool of herself. She got out of the car before she could change her mind. The rain soaked through her coat within seconds. She walked across the parking lot to the building entrance, her heels clicking on wet pavement, and found James's apartment number on the directory. 3rd floor, Unit 307. She climbed the stairs because waiting for an elevator felt impossible. By the time she reached his door, her hair was dripping and her hands were shaking. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the numbers on the door, trying to remember how to breathe. Then she rang the bell. There was no going back now. She heard footsteps inside, the sound of a lock turning. The door opened, and James stood there in jeans and an old sweater, looking at her like she was a hallucination. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Alexandra watched his expression shift from confusion to shock to something she could not quite name. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but her voice caught. James finally broke the silence, his voice low and uncertain. He said her name like a question. Alexandra. What are you doing here? She still could not form words. She just stood there, soaked and shivering, feeling more exposed than she had ever felt in her life. James stepped back and gestured for her to come inside. She walked past him into the small apartment, dripping water onto the worn carpet. The space was nothing like her penthouse. It was small and cluttered in the way homes with children always are. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator, toys scattered near the couch, a stack of library books on the coffee table. It felt lived in and real in a way her own home never had. James disappeared for a moment and came back with a towel. He handed it to her without meeting her eyes. Alexandra took it and dried her face, trying to pull herself together. They stood in the small living room, the silence stretching between them. James finally asked if she wanted to sit down. Alexandra nodded and lowered herself onto the couch, still clutching the damp towel. James sat in the chair across from her, maintaining distance, his expression guarded. He looked tired, she noticed. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there a month ago. She wondered if he had been sleeping any better than she had. Alexandra forced herself to speak. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. She told him she had accepted his resignation because it was the right decision for him. But she had never accepted losing him. The words hung in the air between them. James stared at her like she had just spoken a language he did not understand. He asked her what she meant. What was she talking about? They had been CEO and employee. He had quit. That was the end of it. Alexandra felt something crack open inside her chest. She shook her head and told him no. It was not just that. Did he really think those late-night calls were just about work? Did he think she stayed on the phone with all her employees past midnight, talking about loneliness and regret and dreams they had given up? "James," she said, and her voice broke on his name. "You were the only person who made me feel like I was more than just a title. You were the only one I could be myself with." James stood up abruptly and turned away from her. He ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders tense. When he spoke, his voice was rough. He said she could not just show up here and say things like that. She had no idea what she was asking for. She was a CEO. She had power, money, a life that made sense. He was unemployed, living in a rental apartment, barely keeping his head above water. They existed in completely different worlds. Alexandra stood too, taking a step toward him. She asked if he really thought she cared about any of that. She told him she had grown up poor, that she knew what it was like to count pennies and worry about rent. Money did not impress her. Titles did not impress her. What impressed her was watching him walk out of a critical meeting because his daughter needed him. What impressed her was the way he chose his child over his career without hesitation. She had spent her whole life building a company, and she still did not know how to choose people over success. But he did. That was worth more than anything she had achieved. James turned back to face her. His expression was torn between hope and fear. He asked why she had waited 3 weeks. If this mattered so much, why had she let him walk away? Why had she been so cold during that final meeting in her office? Alexandra felt tears burning behind her eyes. She told him she needed him to be completely free. If she had asked him to stay while he was still her employee, he would have always wondered if she wanted him for himself or for what he could do for the company. She did not want him to carry that doubt, and she had needed time to be sure this was not just a reaction to losing someone important. She had to know it was real. The apartment was so quiet Alexandra could hear the rain against the windows. James was looking at her with an expression she could not read. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told her he was scared. He was scared this would not work. She was used to being in control, to having power, to getting what she wanted. He could not offer her that kind of life. He could offer her a man who was still figuring things out, who came with a 7-year-old daughter and more baggage than he knew what to do with. Was she sure that was what she wanted? Alexandra closed the distance between them. She was close enough now to see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she had been carrying. She told him she had spent her entire life proving she was strong enough, smart enough, tough enough. But she was tired of performing. She did not need control. She did not need power. She just needed him. She was willing to risk everything. The rumors, the judgment, the possibility that it might not work. She would rather try and fail than spend the rest of her life wondering what could have been. James searched her face like he was looking for proof she meant it. Then he asked her what happened if this fell apart. What happened when people started talking, when the board started questioning her judgment, when the reality of his life turned out to be too messy for what she was used to. Alexandra reached out and took his hand. She told him she had already lost him once. That had been worse than anything people could say about her. If this did not work out, at least she would know she had been brave enough to try. Something shifted in James's expression. The guarded look cracked, and underneath it was the same raw vulnerability she had heard in his voice during those late-night calls. He told her he had missed her. Every single day since he left, he had missed her. Not the job, not the salary, just her. The way she listened. The way she understood things he did not have to explain. He had convinced himself he was not allowed to want this, that someone like her would never choose someone like him, but he had been lying to himself. Alexandra felt her own walls crumbling. She told him she had been lying to herself too. She had been pretending the merger mattered, that success was enough, that she could just keep moving forward like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She did not want to live in that empty penthouse anymore. She did not want to sit in meetings where no one challenged her. She did not want to be the Iron Lady everyone was afraid of. She wanted to be the person she was during those phone calls. The person who could admit she was lonely and scared and did not have all the answers. James pulled her closer. He told her this would not be easy. His daughter came first. Always. Any relationship would have to move slowly, carefully, with her needs at the center. There would be no grand gestures or fast commitments, just two people trying to figure out how to build something real. Alexandra nodded against his shoulder. She told him slow was fine. She had waited 42 years to feel like this. She could wait a little longer to do it right. They stood there in the middle of his small living room, holding on to each other like they were both afraid to let go. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle patter. The apartment was warm and quiet except for the sound of their breathing. After a while, James pulled back slightly and looked at her. He asked if she wanted coffee. It was a mundane question, absurdly normal after everything they had just said. Alexandra laughed, a real laugh that surprised them both. She said yes. Coffee sounded perfect. They moved to the kitchen, a space so small they kept bumping into each other. James made coffee while Alexandra leaned against the counter, watching him. They did not talk about logistics or plans or what came next. They just existed together in the moment, comfortable in a way that felt both new and familiar. When the coffee was ready, they sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around warm mugs, and talked about nothing important. The weather, the library books stacked in the living room, a movie his daughter wanted to see. It was ordinary and easy, and exactly what both of them needed. At some point, James reached across the table and took her hand. He told her he was glad she came. Alexandra squeezed his fingers and told him she was, too. She did not regret walking away from the party, from Marcus Reed's appropriate courtship, from the safe and sensible path everyone expected her to follow. This felt right in a way nothing else had in a very long time. James smiled, and it transformed his whole face. He told her they would figure it out, one step at a time. Alexandra believed him. When she finally left just after midnight, the rain had stopped. James walked her down to her car, and they stood there in the parking lot like teenagers who did not want the night to end. He told her to drive safely. She promised she would. Then she got in her car and sat there for a moment, watching him walk back into the building. She felt lighter than she had in weeks, maybe years. For the first time in a long time, the future did not feel like a strategic plan. It felt like possibility. 1 month later, on a Sunday afternoon in late January, James and Alexandra sat on a bench in the park watching the first snow of the year fall in soft, steady flakes. His daughter was 20 feet away, building a lopsided snowman with another child from the playground. Alexandra had brought the scarf the snowman now wore. They had been taking things slowly, exactly as James had insisted. Coffee dates, walks in the park, long phone calls that no longer felt like secrets. Alexandra had met his daughter 3 times now, always as his friend, never pushing for more. The little girl seemed cautiously accepting, which felt like a victory. James took her hand. He told her he was grateful she had been brave enough to come to his door that night. Alexandra told him she was grateful he had been brave enough to open it. The snow continued to fall. His daughter called out that the snowman was finished and demanded they come see it. James and Alexandra stood, hands still linked, and walked over together. It was not a grand ending. It was something better. It was a beginning.